Thanks so much to Ferreo for being our partner on this video. So Georgiana Darcy almost elopes with Mr. Wickham at Ramsgate, but how did that go down? What is the story behind the Georgiana Darcy, Mr. Wickham relationship? What would have happened if they had actually eloped to Gretna Green? And all the other drama in this very interesting summer of Georgiana's life. Well, that's what we're going into here in today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So first of all, elopements in the Regency era. We see this as a common trope in Jane Austen's novels and also other novels of the time period because it was art reflecting life. People were seriously eloping back in the day. And if you see my recent video on secret marriages, you know that was partially driven by the fact that they had established laws that made it illegal for anyone under 21 to get married without their parents' permission. Now, if you are, for example, 15-year-old Georgiana Darcy or 16-year-old Lydia Bennet, and you know your guardians are not going to give their permission, that means you need to run away with your lover and elope somewhere else where it is legal to get married at that age, and that would of course be Scotland. So eloping couples in this time period would just go up to Scotland, cross over, get married, and then come back to England, now married, and their marriage was still valid once they came back to England. Now, if you've ever wondered where the lore of Gretna Green comes from, Gretna Green was the first city when you sort of crossed over the English-Scottish border on one of the main roads that you would hit. And it sort of turned these elopement marriages into a little bit of an industry. That was what the town was famous for. It was like the Las Vegas of Scotland. It was come here, we'll elope you. However, we will talk more about Gretna Green later in this video. First of all, let's rewind a bit to the very start of elopement. And the start of any good elopement is a forbidden romance, right? Because that's why they had to eventually elope, because their love was forbidden. But who are all of these terrible parents who are just forbidding their children's romances? Well, of course, the specific reason was varied depending on the family. Of course, the most common one was the issues of money and social class. And so, of course, you did not want the Georgianas of the world being taken advantage by fortune hunters who just want to marry him for their money. But also, even among the wealthy, they'd be like, yeah, but your family's not wealthy enough to marry my child, right? We definitely see this being portrayed in a huge way. For example, in Sense and Sensibility with Mrs. Ferris only wanting the best for her son, and Eleanor Dashwood is not that. Now, were most parents that money hungry? No, and I think that's one of the reasons we see Mrs. Ferris portrayed so negatively in Sense and Sensibility. Like I've talked about in past videos, Regency parents were actually quite romantic, and they did want their children to find love and fall in love, but they also wanted them to be well provided for and to stay within a certain social rank, right? It's just I don't want you to have this terrible life of marrying down socially. And so the overall vibe was yes, please fall in love, have the wonderful romance, but make sure it's with a rich guy. Just so we're on the same page. Fall in love with the right guy. I mean, this stuff was going down in real life. It's not just in Jane Austen novels. However, let's take this back to a Jane Austen novel and ask the question, how did the Georgie Wickham romance start? And to understand that, let's go to the book and really look at Georgiana's life. This is what the book says. Mr. Darcy writes, about a year ago, she was taken from school in an establishment formed for her in London. And last summer, she went with the lady who presided over it to Ramsgate. So here we see 15-year-old Georgiana Darcy being taken from boarding school and having an establishment made for her in London. Now, I imagine that more than likely to be the Darcy family townhome that they definitely owned, we learned from the book, and that does make sense with their family social position and standing in the book as well. However, one of the reasons he would have to form an establishment is he would have to hire extra servants. Like we talked in our video about servants, these family townhomes in London would be staffed by a skeleton crew, but it would not be enough to support the family while living there without bringing in additional servants, whether that is from your country house, or in this case, Darcy actually probably went out and hired a few servants, perhaps like cooks and other ones, just to bring up his sister's standard of living while she's at the townhouse full time now. So he staffed up their townhouse for her. And then one of the people he definitely hired was Mrs. Young as the governess. So she would have not only overseen Georgiana's education, she would have also protected her reputation as a single young lady living alone in London and been her companion and just gone places with her. She was pretty much responsible for Georgiana. So here we see Georgiana being taken from boarding school and now being given a private governess. And the question might become, why? Why this transition? Because usually a young lady would not leave boarding school until she had completed her education, unless either her family couldn't afford it anymore or she just didn't find it personally appealing. Now, in the case of Georgiana, clearly her family could still afford it. So there must be another reason she's being taken from boarding school. And more than likely, I would say that's because she has social anxiety. Later, when Lizzie meets Georgiana, this is how she comes across. It says, "The observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy." So Georgiana is this exceedingly shy girl who boarding school would have been super overwhelming for. You know, as we get to know Georgiana more and more in the book, we know that she's super anxious when speaking, even in her own group of friends at Pemberley when Elizabeth is there. She's very diffident. She's not sure of herself. And so to be at a probably fashionable boarding school in London would have been a nightmare, because you know what other type of students went to these boarding schools? Girls like the Miss Bingleys. Pride and Prejudice in the Bingley backstory says this about the Bingley sisters. They were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the first private seminaries in town. So can you imagine shy little Georgiana having to deal with a class full of Miss Bingleys? Even if they were all just trying to like sort of kiss up to her because she definitely came from money and status, that still would have not been easy on Georgie. So in my imagination, at least, Georgie probably let her brother know, like, is there any way I can come home? I don't like being here. And he was kind enough to take her out of school and go through all the trouble of like setting her up with staff, finding a governess, just so she could be at home, so she could be happier and better at peace. And I'm like, isn't Darcy just such a great brother? Like, we know Mrs. Reynolds tells us he is later in the book, but like, this is so sweet if you really think about it, because this would have actually been more trouble for him to go through all of these steps than just to leave her at boarding school. So of course, when hiring the governess, Mr. Darcy would have looked at the candidates pretty closely. He would have been looking for things like, what is their educational background? How genteel are they? Do they have the manners of a lady? Like, what accomplishments do they have to offer to Georgiana? And them being as well off as they are, he probably would have expected quite a bit in the candidate to fill this position. So it's really fascinating that Mrs. Young is able to, first of all, get recommended to this position, because Darcy more than likely filled it through his own social network of being like, does anyone know a good governess? And she comes across as meeting all of these qualifications. So there is definitely some deep level of deceit going on here. So there is Georgie in London enjoying her new life. She doesn't have to deal with all the girls at boarding school anymore. Instead, she just gets to stay at home. Whenever her brother's in town, she gets to see him. It's just all great. And then it comes to summer, and the best thing happens ever. She gets to go to Ramsgate. Now, of course, in England, there were a lot of coastal towns that were trying to attract tourists, whether it's Lydia, Brighton, or the many other places we see mentioned in Jane Austen's and other novels. But when it comes to Ramsgate, it's interesting because it was a little bit more off the beaten path, but still very popular with the gentry, nobility, and even royalty. So this was a kind of quieter vacationing place that was just perfect for someone like Georgiana, who didn't really like big crowds, but still wanted to go see the ocean. And this is what Ramsgate was described like during the time period. Ramsgate, a hamlet belonging to the parish of St. Lawrence, commanding an extensive prospect over the part of the sea called the Downs, where you behold a number of ships laying at anchor or on their passage to different parts of the world. From hence you may likewise see the lofty cliffs of France, reverberating the light of the sun, while at the same time you may, by way of amusement, watch the motions of every boat coming in and going out of the harbor. And as the sea is always varying, its appearance altogether affords an agreeable amusement. Here, the company frequently stop to rest themselves after a morning's or an evening's walk, and are sweetly regaled by the cool, refreshing breezes of the sea. Anciently, it was a poor fishing town, containing a few mean houses, but somewhat more than a century ago, its inhabitants participating largely in the trade to Russia and Germany, it began to emerge from its original insignificance, and that since it became known and frequented as a bathing place, the old houses have not only been improved, but many new and handsome buildings have been erected. Meanwhile, a Victorian guide adds, as a sea bathing place, it has been countenanced by royalty, and all the leading members of the family of King George III, including Her Most Gracious Majesty when Princess Victoria, with her illustrious mother, the Duchess of Kent, her aunt, the late Queen Caroline, and the lamented Princess Charlotte of Wales, have visited it in turn. So, of course, Georgiana would not have been there at the same time as Queen Victoria, because this would be well before Queen Victoria was even born. But she could have crossed paths with Princess Charlotte at Ramsgate. Now, Princess Charlotte was the member of the royal family fit to be queen next. She was next in line before she died in childbirth. However, during her lifetime, she did read Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility and was quite a fan. She felt like she really connected with Marianne Dashwood. So, would this Marianne Dashwood princess have been at Ramsgate while Georgiana was there? It is a possibility. So there is Georgiana Darcy at Ramsgate. The sea air has done her good. It's blown so much color into her cheeks, which, you know, from the Beauty video, blushing was like the ultimate way to be beautiful in the Regency era. So she's just like, I've really got my beauty going on. I'm at the ocean. I don't have to go to boarding school anymore. This is amazing. And she's just getting closer and closer to Mrs. Young, who's just so kind to her and just the best friend governess any girl could ever dream of. And then one day they go out walking and they head along the town's favorite promenade, which runs along the top of the Ramsgate Pier. And this is how it's described. It forms the favorite walk for company, and certainly none can be more delightful or more salubrious. It commands views of the Downs, the coast of France, the towns of Deal and Sandwich, and many of the hills and fertile valleys of East Kent, while the sea breezes are as well enjoyed as though a person were floating on the bosom of the deep. So there she is, floating on the bosom of the deep, looking at the cliffs of France with her best friend governess, and then guess what? A gentleman bumps into her. But it's all okay because you'll never guess who it is. It's Mr. Wickham. So George Wickham has been a family friend for Georgiana's entire life. She knew him when she was little, but she didn't remember him being this cute. I mean, like, did he get cuter? I think he got cuter. And yeah, he's just so friendly. At first, Georgie feels awkward because she hasn't seen him in a few years and she doesn't entirely know why. Her brothers just stopped inviting him to things. But pretty soon she feels perfectly at ease, which is surprising to her because she doesn't normally feel comfortable around gentlemen. But he's just so kind and they grew up together. And yeah, it's just so great to finally have a friend here at Ramsgate too. Because even though Georgie's very introverted, it was getting kind of lonely here in this town where she doesn't know anybody and it's way too awkward to talk to the princess. So She now has a friend. And even better yet, he's also somehow friends with her governess. Mrs. Young seems to know him, just a little bit though. They say they've only met a couple of times, but Mrs. Young definitely approves and thinks he is the perfect friend for her charge there at Ramsgate. So Georgie goes to bed so happy that night. She's made a friend in town. The ocean's beautiful. The cliffs of France are sparkling. And she has sweet dreams. The next morning, she sets off on a walk again. Maybe she'll bump into Mr. Wickham and they can talk more about the good old days. But alas, he's not on the pier. So she leaves the embrace of the ocean wave breeze and heads back into town, but on her way, she goes into Burgess's library that was described as valuable and extensive and has a good stationery and toy shop attached to it with abundant supplies of newspapers and periodical publications. Who does not love a good bookshop, stationery shop, toy shop combo? I think it's really giving Barnes & Noble, guys. However, of course, toys during the time period meant little trinkets like snuff boxes or candle holders that were just sort of a little bit over the top, but also just like kind of cool. Like they were a vibe, guys. Guess who she runs into? Mr. Wickham. So he falls right along beside her as they're looking at stationery and they start chatting all about the good old days. It brings back all the memories of when her parents were still alive and when Darcy wasn't so busy all the time, and how Wickham and Darcy would come home from school on their break and they'd play with her if it was too rainy for them to actually go out riding or hunting or something. As the book says, Georgie's affectionate heart retained a strong impression of his kindness to her as a child. So there she was, just remembering all the kindness of when she was younger. And he's just so still nice to this day. And it's so comforting to know someone from the past and just have all of those memories back. But as their shopping expedition draws to a close, Mrs. Young decides to invite Wickham for their expedition the next day to Richborough Castle, an ancient Roman stronghold. Mr. Wickham, of course, accepts this invitation. So the next morning, he meets them outside of their inn, and they all climb into a rented traveling chaise to head out for the day. On the journey through the blooming English countryside, he just tells so many stories, and Georgie feels more and more comfortable around him. And about an hour and a half later, they arrive at Richborough Castle. The interesting ruins of Richborough Castle, majestic even in decay, and highly worthy of the traveler's attention. Here, the Roman legions sent to reinforce their army in Britain and to maintain the possession of the country were usually landed, and during 1,000 years continued to be a place of great importance, but was at length reduced by the Danes in the 11th century. So by the Regency era, it looked like this. Massive fragments of the walls, mantled with ivy, are interspersed amongst standing corn. So as they walked by these massive walls covered in ivy and wound through the cornfield, Mrs. Young just started fading further and further into the background, giving Georgie and Wickham plenty of room to get to know each other without her immediate presence. And Georgie's just so happy. This is such a fun trip. This is so amazing that these Roman walls are still standing after all of this time. And Wickham has found something. So, in the dirt around Richborough Castle, people could still find coins and other Roman jewelry. As one writer put it, the curious relics which have been discovered in so great abundance. So, he found her a Roman coin. She's just so excited. This is the best day ever. And after they're done looking at all of the walls, they decide to have a picnic. So they go to the nearby village of Ash. The village will also be found deserving of notice on account of the rural neatness of its cottages and the high and admirable state of cultivation which distinguishes the neighborhood and is truly creditable to the cultivators of the land. So there they are in the ideal little village with the cute little cottages and the fields of corn, having a picnic. And Georgie, just something about the way Wickham looks at her makes her feel so beautiful and fascinating, and she's never felt this way before in her life. Like, people have called her handsome before, but she just always thought that was because she was from a wealthy family. And they kind of had to, because what young lady was not called handsome? But when Wickham says it, it feels like it's true. She feels like she really is the most fascinating woman in the world. And that evening, after they get back to their inn and say goodbye to Wickham, Mrs. Young hints that it's not just in her imagination. She says that she's never seen a gentleman so captivated by a young lady's charm before in her life. Could this be real? Was he completely captivated and perhaps even in love? However, as Georgie goes to bed, she feels slightly unsettled by something that had happened earlier that day. Mr. Wickham had requested a dance at the next assembly. Georgie's never been to a ball in her life. She's only 15, and she knows that her brother will tell her when it's the appropriate time to come out in society, but he has not said so yet, and she didn't expect him to say so for several more years. It would be entirely improper for her to go to a ball when her brother has not even told her she can come out in society yet, right? No, Mrs. Young assures her. It's different at Ramsgate. You're not in the city, and he's just an old family friend, and it's just a little ball here. I'm sure your brother will quite understand, and why don't you say yes? So Georgie does. But before we continue, check out this video's sponsor. So I'm so excited to partner with Foreo Sweden on this video. Foreo is a cutting-edge skincare brand that empowers people to shape the way they age, and as I am aging, I really appreciate that. So lately I've been using their FAQ 202, that is an LED face mask that has 8 different wavelengths that are able to address a wide variety of skin concerns. So a couple of times a week I go into the FAQ app and I select the pre-programmed anti-wrinkle treatment that combines 4 different wavelengths that address everything from wrinkles and fine lines to spots and hyperpigmentation. And I really do feel like my skin is smoother and more vibrant since I started using the mask. I am in love with the results. I'm also in love with how lightweight, comfortable, and wireless it is. I can do a treatment while literally doing anything else. For example, I can do chores, make breakfast, confuse my cats as to why I look like a futuristic Roman soldier, all while taking care of my skin. So if you would like to check out the FAQ 202 and Foreo's other bestsellers, then definitely click the link in the description box below and use my code DASH30 for an additional 30% off all of Foreo's products, including products that are already on sale. This code is stackable, which is my favorite type of code, so definitely check them out. Now back to the video. The next evening, Georgie is all in a flutter. She heads off to her first ball at the assembly rooms. The assembly room is situated near the harbor, and it is a neat fabric with annex coffee, tea, billiards, and card rooms. The amusements are under the direction of the Master of the Ceremonies of Margate. And there was Georgie entering the assembly rooms to meet that Master of Ceremonies exactly at 8 o'clock, because when you needed to meet the Master of Ceremonies, you needed to be punctual. It says, the Master of Ceremonies requests the favor of such ladies and gentlemen, whom he has not the honor of knowing personally, that they will afford him an early occasion of being introduced to them, as it is not only his wish that all improper company should be kept from the rooms, but as he is, and ever will be, ambitious to show every individual that attention which is not more his duty than his inclination to observe. So there's the Master of Ceremonies. On one hand, acting like a bouncer, keeping any undesirables out, and on the other hand, being quite pleased when Miss Darcy of Pemberley arrives. It's such a pleasure to have her in the assembly rooms here. And the assembly rooms also accept her 5 shillings payment as a non-subscriber and non-local to the area. But after meeting the master of ceremonies and paying the 5 shillings, she's there in the ballroom and she looks around and there Mr. Wickham is. He is early too. And they're going to dance their first dance together. Now, of course, Georgie has practiced dancing her entire life, and especially at boarding school, they would have regular practice dances with the nearby boys' boarding school, right? So she has even danced with young gentlemen before, but none of those young gentlemen are anything like her partner tonight. His countenance, his air, he's truly the finest gentleman she's ever seen. And she's pretty sure he's the finest gentleman any other lady in the room has ever seen either. Because they are all looking at her like, ooh, who is that guy? Who are you? What is going on here? And she's just like, this is the most exciting ball I've ever been to. This is the only ball I've ever been to. Whole ballroom just seems to whirl around her like it's a dream, and soon their 2 dances come to an end. And since she doesn't plan on dancing with anyone else, Wickham suggests that they take a bit of night air on the pier, and she readily agrees. And so they're out there on the pier in the darkness. The sea breeze is again hugging them because that's what the sea breeze loves to do here. And Mrs. Young just seems to be quite slow tonight. She just pulls back further and further and further and following them. And soon Georgie finds Wickham grab her hand and very earnestly say, Georgiana, I have something I must speak with you about. That he loves her and he wants to marry her, and nothing in the universe will bring him greater happiness than her saying yes. But will Georgie say yes? Georgie doesn't even know what to do. What does she feel like? This is completely unprecedented territory we're in here now. Georgie has never even been to a ball before, much less got proposed to. Things seem to have escalated very quickly, but at the same time, Mr. Wickham seems to act like this is a perfectly normal pace for a romance to move at, and as does Mrs. Young. And Georgie is not one to question them, especially when the finest gentleman she's ever seen in her life has now declared him her undying lover. But at the same time, there is another gentleman that keeps coming into her mind. She can clearly see the face of her brother. If her brother won't let her go to a ball at 15, there is no chance in the world he's going to let her marry Wickham. And then there's that other whole kind of strange thing that she hasn't seen Wickham in years. And she starts to really think like, wait, why did my brother say that was again? Well, I guess he didn't really give a reason, but he didn't seem very friendly about it. Does he not like Wickham? Does he not approve? And Mr. Darcy's approval is 100% required because at 15 years old, he needs to sign a certificate of consent for her to get married. He could do it. Or technically, Colonel Fitzwilliam could do it. He can sign the certificate of consent. He is her guardian. And if you have more than one legal guardian as established by your father's will, either one of them can sign the certificate. It doesn't have to be both. But Colonel Fitzwilliam does tend to, leave most of the decision making to her brother. And she highly doubts that he would override Darcy on such a thing as important as her marriage. Colonel Fitzwilliam will be no help at all in this situation. But, I don't know. What does one do in this situation? But it's okay, because Wickham assures her that she doesn't have to answer now. Just think about it. Just think about it, dear Georgie. Georgiana can't sleep that night. She does not know what to do. On one hand, she's never felt more in love with anyone herself. That must be what this feeling is, right? That you cannot sleep and you have butterflies in your stomach and you can't breathe when he hands you a Roman coin. And clearly she loves him. But again, she needs her brother permission to marry him. They could just wait till she's 21. But what if even when she's 21, Darcy doesn't agree? And even though she could legally marry him at 21 without Darcy's approval, could she ever truly marry without her brother's approval? And if she had to marry without her brother's approval anyway, she may as well do it now. I mean, she has no reason to think he wouldn't approve. Could he really hold the fact that his father was a steward against him? Could Darcy just judge so unjustly? Of course not. Her brother was perfect. But at the same time, she just thinks of the fact that all connection between them had seemed dissolved, though Darcy didn't explain why. And he wasn't even admitted into his society in town or the country. Georgie knew him to be perfectly amiable, so if she marries him, then Darcy will then eventually see how great a guy he is, and then he'll accept him into the family and everything will be wonderful. Potentially, possibly, maybe. The next morning when Georgie got up, she had a terrible headache. She'd barely slept, but Mrs. Young did seem very determined that they go see Eastcliff. So Eastcliff was, of course, a great country house nearby, and touring great country houses was, of course, the pastime you should do on your vacation. So that is what Georgie does. She goes to tour Eastcliff, which was delightfully situated about half a mile to the north of Ramsgate, is a handsome marine villa in the Gothic taste, erected years since as a retreat from the noise and bustle of the metropolis. So the housekeeper warmly welcomes them and starts showing them around the house, but Georgie can't pay attention. She can't appreciate the art or see the fact that the dining room in the Gothic taste is of exquisite workmanship and beauty, and the lower end is an elegant screen of Gothic columns through which a pair of folding doors of curious workmanship lead into a vestibule. But that means nothing to her. Wickham proposed. And that's all she can think of as the housekeeper turns him over to the gardener to look at the gardens. And is that Wickham in the gardens? Why is he here? She's going to have to face him. For some reason, he's already wandering around the gardens of Eastcliff. How did he know they were going to be there? That's impossible. I mean, Mrs. Young wouldn't have told him. I guess he just has excellent taste in country houses too. But Georgie relaxes a little because after their greetings, Wickham doesn't seem to pressure her. In fact, he spends most of the time talking to the gardener. He knows so much about plants. In fact, he knows so much about everything. How is he the most perfect man that's ever existed in the world? But something he knows a fascinating amount about is the Eastcliff Caverns, which are caverns the family specifically had dug out that go from the top of a cliff down to the ocean because they didn't want to have to go all the way into the town of Ramsgate every time they wanted to stand on the beach and feel the waves on their feet. So there are these secret caverns, and Mr. Wickham asks, can they go through the caverns? The gardener readily agrees and adds that the caverns never look better than in the summertime. But as they come near the mouth of the cavern to go down to the ocean, Mrs. Young holds back. She says she's terrified of such a confining place, but insists Georgie go on with Wickham. She feels like Wickham is perfectly capable of taking good care of her charge as they go look at the ocean, and she would not have Georgie miss the caverns for the life of her. So Georgie agrees and goes in to the caverns. The excavations open at a distance of 30 feet from the edge of the cliff and descend by a gradual inclination to the shore. These passages are very singular in their construction. They receive their light from arches so long in dimension as to resemble rooms, cut at right angles through the chalk to the sea. The bottoms of these arches are in the summer carpeted with grass and shrubs and flowers, which give them a very picturesque and beautiful appearance. They walk along the carpet of grass and flowers until suddenly Wickham stops and he turns to her. The look on her face knows what's about to come next as he asks, "What is my fate to be?" And she can't bring herself to say yes. All she can say is, "My brother will never approve." Georgiana is so heartbroken as she says this. She starts to cry, but Wickham, even though his heart must be breaking too, he comforts her. And how she knows not how to thank him. And as he comforts her, he says, but your brother must only want for your happiness. And when he sees how happy you are with me, he must give us his blessing. So let us elope, Georgiana, to Scotland. For I cannot live without you. Georgiana felt all the truth of his words. Her brother was the best brother in the world, and he could only want for her happiness. And she was happy that she's never been so loved and so not alone in her life. She had been so alone at boarding school and so alone after her parents died, and now she had someone who wanted to love her forever. And as the book says, she was persuaded to believe herself in love and to consent to an elopement. Now that it was decided, Georgiana felt not just peace, but some excitement. She had read novels her entire life of romantic elopements, and now it was her turn. So, from these novels, she had learned some essential steps that every good heroine needed in order to elope to Scotland. The first one was a plan. Eloping that far actually required a lot of forethought and funds. Wickham, it seemed, did not have enough funds on hand to pay for the entire journey. They were with his banker in London, but thankfully, he didn't need to go to London to get the money. Rather, Georgie had enough to cover all of the carriage fare and horse fare and inns all the way up to Scotland. This would be a multi-day affair. In fact, it's such a big undertaking. Georgie let him know that they could not possibly go tonight, but maybe the day after tomorrow, because she needed to pack. She needed to keep an appointment with an acquaintance she made the next day. And overall, she just needed to process the fact that she was about to run away to Scotland and get married. This was the biggest thing to ever happen to her in her life. The next thing Georgiana needed to plan was the dramatic escape. So the thing was, there was a few different ways to do this. Some girls would just go out for a walk, right? Like very Lizzie Bennet style, like I'm just going to go for a walk and then just never come home. That was one way you could elope, the go on a walk, never come home method. Though it was much more dramatic and romantic when you escaped at night, either by being lowered through a window or by sneaking past a footman who would sleep next to your front door and unlock the door while he was asleep right next to it. That was expert level eloping. However, Georgie didn't feel like she would have to do that because as soon as she got back into the carriage, Mrs. Young took one look at her and knew immediately that she was going to elope. Mrs. Young's powers of discernment were beyond all understanding. How she could take one look at Georgie and instantly say, "Are you eloping, my dear?" was beyond Georgie. But at the same time, when the question was first asked, Georgie just broke out crying because she was already caught and she couldn't bring herself to lie. But much to her surprise and great relief, Mrs. Young thought this elopement was an amazing idea. She thought there could be no one better in the world to be her husband than Wickham. Everything would be fine. This was a brilliant idea. This made Georgie feel so reassured she had made the right choice. And this was taking something else off of her planning list too, because she needed to find a chaperone who would chaperone her on her elopement. Because even though a young lady was about to throw caution to the wind and run away to Scotland to get married, that did not mean that she did not take care of her reputation. So any young lady of high virtue would take a female companion or maid along with her on the trip, ideally within the carriage. So, some people did gossip and say that marital relations could even be rushed inside of a carriage. So you need your maid in the carriage with you. And because this was a multi-day trip to Scotland, your maid, or your governess in this case, needed to sleep with you in your inn or hotel room, just to, keep everything on the up and up. So no one could say that you had not been the most virtuous young lady in the universe up until the moment you said your vows. However, you needed to make sure your chaperone was also trustworthy and would not spill your secret. As soon as Georgiana gets back to her room at the end, she sits down to do the next essential step, which is write a letter to her brother. Every heroine would write the letter to her family that they would leave behind in their bedroom or with friends that basically said, I'm eloping to Gretna Green. Don't worry, I'm safe. I'll be back when I'm married. And that is now the letter she needs to write, but she just can't do it. She stares at the blank page and it feels unsupportable, the idea of grieving and offending a brother whom she almost looked up to as a father. Can she really do this? Mrs. Young comes in and sees that she's struggling to write the letter, and she says, this is the right decision. And as Georgie always looks to others for confirmation of her choices or for the direction to go and completely does not trust herself to know her own mind on such important matters, she again feels reassured and she writes the most heartbreaking letter of her life. That night, Georgiana struggles to sleep, and when she does, her dreams are a jumbled mixture of everything she knows is coming, of the multi-day trip of being in carriage after carriage after carriage and finally crossing the Scottish-English border. And once in Gretna Green, they would seek out the blacksmith parson, called that not because he was actually a blacksmith, but because he was so quick in creating unbreakable bonds of marriage. And also not even because he was a parson, because he also was not even actually a legitimate member of the clergy of any church of existence. He was just a guy who would marry people for fees. Because again, this is under Scottish common law, which was very similar to what English common law had been and required nothing but mutual declaration of consent by parties before witnesses. But they would still have a clergyman there because it just felt right to have a clergyman there. You should have a clergyman there. And admittedly, he's not a real clergyman, but what are you going to do? He's the best guy around. You have to make do when you're eloping. Of course, Georgie had always imagined a church wedding with Darcy there and the full liturgy from the Book of Common Prayer, all about how marriage was developed in man's infancy. But alas, that was not the marriage ceremony she was looking forward to this night. Instead, it was an incredibly simplified affair. The parties are first asked their names and places of abode, and they are then asked to stand up and inquired of if they are both single persons. If the answer be in the affirmative, the ceremony proceeds. Each is next asked, "Did you come here of your own free will and accord?" Upon receiving an affirmative answer, the priest commences filling in the printed form of the certificate. The man is then asked, "Do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife, forsaking all others, keeping to her as long as you both shall live?" He answers, "I will." The woman is asked the same question, which being answered the same, the woman then produces a ring, which she gives to the man, who hands it to the priest. The priest then returns it to the man and orders him to put it on the fourth finger of the woman's left hand. Repeat these words. "With this ring I thee wed, and my body I thee worship. With all my worldly goods I thee endow in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen." Then they take hold of each other's right hands, and the woman says, "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Then the priest says, For as much as this man and this woman have consented to go together by giving and receiving a ring, I, therefore, declare them to be man and wife before God, and these witnesses in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. And then they would be married forever. So immediately after the ceremony, there's still several more steps to take. First, matters of communication. An eloping couple needs to forward the announcement of their marriage to the newspapers in London. And it would go something like, lately, George Wickham, Esquire, to Miss Georgiana Darcy, daughter of Mr. Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire. That would be the first time she ever saw her married name in print, and it would be so official. But then, after sending off the announcement, she'll have to write a different type of letter to her brother. For a heroine would always be sure to keep her family in good communication about her elopement. And she needs to write, I am officially married now. We are now headed back. We will see you in town or at Pemberley or wherever. Please, 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 please forgive me. This was usually the time when a young couple would start begging their parents for forgiveness now that the deed was done and all that was left is for their parents to accept it. Now, as Georgie continued to think of her impending nuptials, there was one thing she was very, very thankful for, and that was the fact that her family would not be chasing them. Because sometimes, if parents found out too quickly about an elopement, or in this case, it would have been her brother, they might chase the couple all the way to Scotland, trying to overtake them on the road. Some people had like shootouts with their own parents over this. It was drama. And not only that, but a couple being chased that way immediately after the marriage ceremony would usually check into a local inn at Gretna Green and consummate the marriage that very night, because it was considered an additional bar to their separation or any endeavor to set it aside. Georgie was very thankful that that would not have to happen. And the scene that really haunted Georgiana all night was coming home. She would have to beg her brother for forgiveness. And it really depended on the family. Some families forgave eloping couples very quickly. Others took years. Others never really forgave them. Of course, she knew her brother wasn't like that. He loved her far too well. In fact, her brother would forgive them so much to be at her side at her next wedding. So, while a marriage in Gretna Green was 100% legally binding, an eloping couple would usually come back to England and have a second wedding the right way in the Church of England with their families, more as a family, social, religious thing rather than a legal thing, because legally they were already married. And that happy dream of her brother's forgiveness and him being at her wedding someday brought her enough peace to finally fall asleep. Georgiana wakes up the next day, and for a second she doesn't remember. In fact, she doesn't even remember where she is. Is she at home? At Pemberley? Or in London? She certainly hopes she's not at the boarding school. But as the morning grogginess wears away, she remembers all of it. She's about to elope. This is both so incredibly exciting and terrifying at the same time. And then, wait a second. Is that her brother's voice she hears in the next room? Is that her brother she hears calling her name? Has Darcy come to Ramsgate? Georgie will never forget this moment for the rest of her life, and neither will Darcy. Later, he writes to Elizabeth, I joined them unexpectedly, a day or two before the intended elopement. And then, Georgiana, unable to support the idea of grieving and offending a brother, whom she almost looked up to as a father, acknowledged the whole to me. You may imagine how I felt and how I acted. Regard for my sister's credit and feelings prevented any public exposure, but I wrote to Mr. Wickham, who left the place immediately, and Mrs. Young was, of course, removed from her charge. Before Georgie even knew what was happening, she was in a carriage with her brother, headed back to London. And she was heartbroken because Darcy said that Wickham never loved her and that he was always after the money. And Wickham just left when told to. And the only mercy she could see in this entire situation is that they didn't have to stop and see Lady Catherine, because both Ramsgate and Rosings are in Kent, and she was supposed to visit her aunt on her way home. But at least she doesn't have to see her aunt this summer. Meanwhile, her brother sits next to her, furious with himself. How could he have trusted Mrs. Young? He who was supposed to be his sister's protector had failed. And then there was Wickham. He was certain that this was mainly about his sister's money, but there was a different motive too. I cannot help supposing the hope of revenging himself on me was a strong inducement. His revenge would have been complete indeed. He felt like it was entirely his fault. Wickham's motives, the fact that Georgiana was ignorant to Wickham's true character, he had never told her why he never allowed Wickham back at Pemberley. And as he would later say of Elizabeth, detection could not be in your power, and suspicion certainly not in your inclination. His sister was young and trusting, and he had let her go to Ramsgate with a con artist. So as dusk fell, they looked out different windows of the carriage. There was really nothing to say. And Georgiana felt that all of her chances of happiness in life must be over. And she wasn't sure if her brother could ever truly forgive her. And that perhaps eloping to Scotland was not all novels made it seem like. Maybe it was a bad idea after all. And that is the story of Georgie and Wickham, which kind of turned into a little bit of educational fanfic, guys. Let me know in the comments down below, would you have ran away to Gretna Green and been married by a blacksmith priest who was neither a blacksmith nor a priest? There's some serious issues with these elopements, guys. And definitely remember to check out this video's sponsor. Remember to check out Freyo's cutting edge skincare, including my latest favorite, the FAQ 202 face mask. And remember to use my code DASH30 for an extra 30% off all products, including those already on sale. So definitely click the link in the description box below and check them out. And as always, guys, keep being awesome, because you're awesome.